Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conversation on leaving Neverland. If somebody could let me know, wow, we've already got 12 people, it looks like. So, can somebody let me know? Can you hear me okay? I want to make sure everything is working. Hi, Marie and Jamie and Nicola. Another Jamie, or the same Jamie. Candace, hi. Great. So glad you can hear me. So I want to give this kind of just another few seconds or so before I really start this conversation. But I am looking forward to this. I have some notes that I've done. I did notes when I watched the show, and then I kind of condensed that a little bit. So I remember to go over some of the things that I thought were important to go over. So please, as things are coming up, keep commenting, like just kind of your thoughts about it. If you've got questions, I will try to answer your questions, like about things that are coming up and things that you saw, and I'll be asking you questions as well, because I really want I want this to be kind of a conversation for survivors, um, as well as anybody else who might be listening to this, to really have a much better understanding of what it means to be a survivor and why these are really important conversations to have. So, hi, Christina. Hi, Lupe. Yes, and you don't need to have seen it either, because as we kind of go through this, these are things that just in doing this work that I didn't hear anything from their stories that was that unusual, other than obviously who their perpetrator was. Um, but these issues and these concerns and the myths and all of that are things that anybody really has heard before, can relate to. So, absolutely don't have to have seen this, seen Leaving Neverland or After Neverland, in order to have a voice here. Um, and to be a valuable participant in this conversation. So, hi, Kathy. Um, First, I'd like to say, just kind of in case you don't know who I am, I want to introduce myself and then share why I thought this conversation was important. So, for those of you who do not know me, I am, I think, first and foremost, a survivor of sexual abuse and neglect. And I didn't know that I had been affected by abuse. I didn't even know that what happened to me was necessarily abuse for a while. So, long story short, I ended up going into social work and became a therapist and have worked with survivors for nearly 20 years. So, that's kind of who I am and why I've chosen to create this conversation, because I know how impactful hearing other people's stories is, in many good ways, a lot of good ways. It's important for people to share their stories, for us to be able to hear other people's stories, because anytime that we can say me too, we feel less alone. I also think that, or know that there are a lot of ideas and myths and stereotypes out there about abuse, and in particular about what it means to be a survivor. And there were a lot of things that came up in this documentary that, not by the people who share their stories specifically, but just a lot of things that perpetuated some of the ideas, myths, and stereotypes that are out there. So I wanted to take an opportunity to address that. So, um, and one of the biggest pieces of that is how we speak about it ourselves as survivors, and the language that we use to describe our responsibility in the experience, um, and how other people, how their language can really do a lot to either reinforce some of those stereotypes and shame, or using correct language can alleviate a lot of that. And so for me, a lot of the stuff that came up was around languaging And so I'll be sharing quite a bit about that. But again, what came up for you might be different than what came up for somebody else. And I also want to say at the beginning of this that I absolutely believe everything that James Safechuck and Wade Robson shared. I absolutely believe it. I don't need to know them. I don't need to know the person who abused them. I don't need to know anything other than what they shared, because what they shared are things that I've heard over and over again, things that I personally can relate to in many ways. So this isn't about, do we believe them or do we not? I absolutely believe them. Um, this isn't about talking about the person who perpetrated against them. I don't care about that. I don't care about who that is. I don't care that he was a celebrity. I don't care that people are adamant that he never could have done those things. But what is important about that is how many times those of us who are abused by just regular people hear those same things. Oh, he's such a nice guy. Oh, she would never do that. You must be confused. The Supreme Court hearing, right? And people saying that became a thing that yes, maybe she was raped, but she didn't know who the actual perpetrator was. Like, just that kind of stuff drives me crazy. But, so we'll talk about some of that stuff today. Yes, groomed and not seduced. And I will be talking about seduced in a little bit. Hi, Radana. So thank you everybody for joining me. Let's kind of get started. I would like to hear from you what, if you've seen it, or if you've heard people talking about it, because for a lot of people, even if you've not seen it, you've likely seen some things or heard some people kind of talking about why they don't believe them, or why didn't they come forward sooner, or how could they have lied about it? How can they talk about it like that now? It can't be real if they can talk about it like that. So there's different things that maybe you've heard that I'd like to hear from you. What has left you feeling not so good? Or maybe something that did leave you feeling good, something that really felt validating to you. Um, but are there some things that you've heard people talking about or heard in the documentary or the after show itself that left you feeling, well, not so good? Maybe reinforced some shame or some doubt in your own experience in terms of responsibility. So if anybody has anything that you'd like to share on that, please feel free to share now. I want to start. So I mentioned the idea or the experience of languaging and the impact that that has on us as survivors and on society's ideas of abuse and what it means to be a survivor. So the thing that came up often and comes up in general, I have clients who refer to it this way as well. I have as well in the past. But when people are talking about abuse and they refer to it as sex, that's a problem. And I've actually written to news people because they will often say, as they're reporting a situation, they'll say, this teacher had sex with a student. Anytime that you call an abuse experience and anything that has a sexual nature to it between an adult and a child is never sex. But when people use the word sex, whether you're a survivor and you're talking about your own experience or other people are saying it, when we call it sex, we are diminishing the severity of what is actually happening. We are minimizing the truth. And that is a problem because ultimately, survivors are already denying and minimizing the truth. And we do that in order to cope with it. But as society, when people on a public platform, and this isn't a criticism to the two men, but this is why it's important to have an expert also talking about this stuff. when people say they had sex with me, or um, Wade, I think on 2 different occasions in the documentary and then in the after show, said, he said sex between I don't remember exactly how he said it, but he said sex. And then in the after show, he said what happened between he and I, or between us, or something like that. That is not the reality. In an abuse situation, nothing ever happens between those 2 people. It is not sex that happens between those 2 people. It is abuse, it is assault, and sex is the tool that is used. When you, even if you think about, even on a movie specifically, if an adult is raped by a stranger in this movie, they don't refer to it there as having sex, right? I mean, if they're saying she wanted it or something like that, they might. But even like in the legal aspect or whatever, it's never referred to as having sex, because it's not having sex. It is not sex. It is abuse or assault. But as survivors, we often call it that because society refers to it as that. Because we feel like we are a part of that, and we are not. But anytime somebody says that, it reinforces that myth, that lie ultimately. And that is incredibly damaging to survivors, even if consciously you're not thinking about it. Even if consciously you can say, call it sex, but then also call it abuse. On a subconscious level, when you hear sex, or when you say sex, or when you say or hear what happened between us or between you, it's suggesting mutuality. It's suggesting that it's a mutual experience, and it is not under any circumstance. And again, even as survivors, we don't necessarily, in fact, rarely, do we really recognize how we're actually saying it, and certainly not the impact that it's reinforcing on our own sense of responsibility. And so that was kind of a thing throughout. And one of the things that really stood out to me in particular was when this was in the first part of the documentary. Wade was sharing the first time that he had been abused, and he talked about, I think he spent a few days or a handful of days at this place, the ranch, and he said, I came here as a, I don't know, 7-year-old boy or something along those lines, and um, I left his best friend. And then the interviewer, which I think may have been the director or whatever his role would have been. So Wade said, I came as a 7-year-old boy or whatever, and I left his best friend after being assaulted by him. And then the director said, his lover. And Wade said, Wade ended up just agreeing. He said, yeah, lover. And think about that for a moment. And this isn't the first time that I've heard somebody refer to somebody who's abused as being somebody's lover. I've heard it referred to as a father who's assaulting his daughter, it referred to as an affair by the mother. So it's not uncommon. And I'm guessing there are a lot of people, even survivors, who watched that and would have done what Wade did, kind of going along with that idea, yeah, his lover. And this is why people need to be careful about what they're saying. For that director to suggest that a 7-year-old, after being abused, becomes a perpetrator's lover. Like, really think about that. Whoever is watching this in this moment, whether you have an abuse history, whether you know somebody who's been abused, whether you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about, but really think about what I just said. For somebody to suggest that a 7-year-old who has been abused is now that person's lover, that's incredibly messed up. And it's so wrong. It is not the reality. But this is why sexual abuse is so misunderstood, even by survivors, because Wade agreed with him. Because people say things that are really not accurate representations at all, and they're not challenged. Because as survivors, we typically don't feel like we have a voice or a right to challenge because we feel responsible and shameful about it anyway. But if you're doing a documentary about this, you have an obligation to know what you're talking about. You have a responsibility to know what you're talking about. If you're having a conversation with survivors, especially on a public platform, you have a responsibility to know what you're talking about. I make mistakes. I'm not saying that I'm perfect. But we all can do better. We need to do better. And when you have a public platform, you have a responsibility to do better. So I see lots of comments. So let me take a second here. The seduction piece, I am going to be touching on that. So I have it written down, so I'll make sure that I get to that. It bothered me too, Candace. And for anybody watching, in the description of this video, I have a link to an open letter that I shared on social media and on my blog, asking Oprah to be mindful of the language that she uses. So I do want to get back to that as well. Yes, Candace, the mutual peace. Repressed memories coming back in therapy is so BS. Jamie, I'm not quite sure what you're speaking of. If there's something specific, or if you're saying that generally, actually, it is not BS. It does happen. It actually happens quite often. So I'm not sure where that's coming from or what you're trying to suggest, but repressed memories, and sometimes it's not even repressed in the way that people tend to think of repressed. Sometimes they're just not a conscious, like at the forefront of your mind, something that's very vivid. But as you feel safer, as you start exploring and speaking about some of the other things that happened, other things will come up, especially if you have if the abuse happened over a period of time, or if you had multiple abusers. And in part, that can happen because you often don't think of what happened as abuse. Or if you compare it to some other things that happened, it doesn't seem on the same scale, and so you don't think of it as abuse. On the other hand, though, sometimes when you have the safety for those memories to come back, they often do. I've worked with many people over the years who maybe have some memory, but not a lot of memory, or certainly not all memories. And as they feel safe, as they know that they're believed, their mind and their body recognizes that it's safe to start talking about those things. Hi, Pam. Feeling like you're part of it. Um, yeah, new stuff comes up. Why is it that people search for something higher like God when they are at the lowest point? Witness that a lot. Um, I actually can't see very well what your name is, so I apologize for not being able to read that. This is a great question. I don't remember if this is something that came up in the video or in the documentary or not. Um, Honestly, I think that if you've had a history of having a faith in something, it's trying to grasp onto something. And even if you haven't had a history of a specific faith or anything, it's often a way of trying to cope, um, to know that you're not alone, to really have hope that maybe there's something, someone, something out there that can help you when you're struggling the most. Um, and I have seen that happen quite often. And the whole faith and abuse thing is quite a challenge for a lot of people. So I'm just going to check my notes and see where I am here. Um, One of the things that was talked about that I thought I was glad that was shared. James um, and Wade both kind of shared something that I thought was really helpful for survivors and non-survivors to hear, as long as they were able to hear it and not judge. Um, because this is something that happens for a lot of people as well. James spoke about a time when there was abuse that happened, and he woke up and he was staying the night, and he was in his bed, I believe, and he woke up, I believe, in the middle of the night, and the abuser was not there. And when he realized he wasn't there, like he felt badly. Um, if I remember correctly, he like worried that maybe he had done something wrong, or that he was upset, or something like that. And he didn't feel good about the fact that he was gone. And I thought that was a really helpful thing for him to share, um, because it's such a complicated relationship that we have with our abusers, unless it's a stranger, which is very actually rare that it's a stranger. But very often we care about our abuser, often love our abuser, and often depend on our abuser in different ways. Um, and so when he shared that, I was really glad that he shared that, and also wondered how particularly non-survivors may hear that and what judgments they may end up having about it. And Wade shared at some point, um, and I think that this was after, like, he was not the primary person that was being abused by this perpetrator, um, but that when it happened again after a period of time of not being abused, when it happened again, he said that it kind of felt better because he knew that things were okay then. When he was abused again, he knew that they were okay, that he was okay. And I knew at the time that, particularly for non survivors, that a lot of people would have thought, like, what the hell? How can that happen? Like, then blaming him and saying, so it couldn't have been abuse if you felt that way. And that's why I think it's important that this came up and was shared in the way that it was, because this is the reality. We take responsibility for the abuse happening. We take responsibility for how the abuser feels. We end up taking responsibility for almost everything around us. And this is a huge part of the struggle for survivors in terms of not telling, in terms of the shame that we carry, the ways that it impacts us in our lives and in relationships into our adult lives. So I was really glad that they shared that and hoped that it might help people understand, including survivors who have felt shame for feeling similarly, that it helps remove or at least reduce to some extent that abuse has to look a certain way. Kind of like people have always had the idea that rape was a violent thing that happened by a stranger when you were out walking at night by yourself. It's important that people really begin to see that childhood sexual abuse is not typically what people tend to think that it is. Another thing that was shared, actually, let me go back and see here. Attorney and advocate will not let you go to court. Jamie, I'm sorry to hear that. Obviously I don't know what the circumstances of your case are. And when you say your attorney, I don't know if you've got a personal attorney or if it's like a district attorney. If you're not connected to a sexual, like a rape crisis center, I would encourage you to maybe try that and see if you might get some help or support in that way. A lot of shame has come up. Yeah. Whatever that shame is that you're holding on to, it is not your shame. Not your shame. Hashtag not our shame. None of the shame that we carry around any of this is ours. Never has been, never will be, no matter who believes you or doesn't believe you, no matter what judgment you get from other people or support you get from other people. Never, ever has it been your shame. They said that why did they say that they fell in love with him? Is it possible? Yes, it is possible, but not in love like we think of being in love as an adult in a healthy situation. It's a very complicated, traumatic type of love. And part of the reason, and this is an aspect of coping, and this happens when you have a relationship with your abuser, and this happens a lot when the abuser is somebody who plays a significant role in your life. It's based on a traumatic experience, and so it's an incredibly complicated feeling and experience to endure over time, because the love is absolutely not healthy. But it's complicated because, at one point, I don't remember now who said it. It was James. It's at one point, and I think it was actually in the after show, he said that he was struggling with the man who abused him and did all of those horrible things, and the good that he was. And in this particular situation, obviously it's different because most of us are not abused by huge celebrities. Um, but you need, when somebody tells you that they love you, when you need to believe that somebody cares about you, you believe it because then it doesn't feel as much like abuse. Then it doesn't feel traumatic. When you can believe that this person loves you, that they have this special relationship with you that they don't have with anybody else. In a child, not even just in a child's mind, that could happen for an adult as well, but in a child's mind, it creates a circumstance that this is, even though it doesn't feel good on many levels, that this is what love is. And in order to survive, in order to get up every single day and live your life, you need to hold on to the idea that this is love, that he's not a horrible monster or she's not this terrible person, so that you can continue to go on. Because as a child, if you were to see that person as the abuser that they are, that they were choosing to hurt you in such profound ways, it would be too overwhelming. It would be absolutely unbearable. So we kind of make excuses, we rationalize. And if you have a relationship with that person that they're supposed to love you or protect you, or they've told you that they love you and they're doing it because of that or whatever they're telling you, then you need to believe that to a certain extent. And let's be realistic. You know, one of the things that came out of this documentary for me is it felt like a cautionary tale against putting celebrities on a pedestal. Because as society, and this happens in most countries, if not all, we put celebrities on a pedestal. And so when a celebrity pays attention to you, especially if they're talking about helping you with your career or something like that, then you want to believe that because you feel that you matter more. And as children, we need to know that we matter. And when you look up to somebody, and this is why being abused by a clergy person is such a significant betrayal, because we see them in a very different light. So is it possible that they could love an abuser? Absolutely, but not in a healthy way. Not in a healthy way at all. But it feels like love, and that's part of the reason why it becomes so complicated, why relationships end up being so complicated in life later, why most people who seek therapy, it's often because they're struggling with relationship stuff. Ube, yes, without including an expert on the after show panel, global attention to sexual abuse has equally created global shame to the abused. And this is part of the struggle that I have. And why I've kind of taken, when I see somebody on a big public platform talk about something in a way that survivors especially might hear, that could reinforce something that isn't true, I've kind of started talking about that in a public way, because clearly I don't have the platform that all those other people do, but I have people who listen, and I want them to hear that just because you're hearing somebody that you look up to say something, and that could include me, just because I talk about this stuff, if you hear something that I say that you don't agree with, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right and you're wrong. But we need people on the other side. We need people, no matter what it is. If you're talking about somebody who has a medical condition and you have a big platform and you're talking about what it means to have that condition or how somebody might feel or whatever, you should have somebody on that panel who knows what they're talking about. Whether it's somebody who has the condition, which would be good, but I think it's also important to have an expert in some way who understands that, because even as somebody with a condition or even as a survivor, we're caught up in our own beliefs about it. We're caught up in our own responsibility about it. So, like when James and Wade were saying, um, when referring to it as having sex or whatever, they believe that still. So just because you have somebody talking about it who's been through it doesn't necessarily mean that they understand all the truth about what it means to be a survivor or even the nuances. But I do think it's important to have survivor perspectives for sure. Hi, Dana. Um, Watching 20 minutes behind. Oh, that's interesting. So you start watching this live. Are you? I didn't know that. That's helpful to know. Okay. Ah, so Candace is talking about the boys, men, must have been gay. Whenever this is something, I mean, all of it obviously breaks my heart, but when there's enough to deal with as a survivor to feel like you are then questioning your own sexuality because you were abused by the same gender, is just, that is a societal thing. That's not something we inherently would do naturally. Um, and part of that is just because of the judgment that we have about homosexuality. But being abused by the same gendered person has absolutely nothing to do with your own sexuality, nor does it really have anything to do with the perpetrator's sexuality. If a man abuses a male child, it does not make him gay. Because remember, sexual abuse and sexual assault are not about sex. So, or a female abusing a female child does not mean that she's gay. It does not make that child gay. But I know that that is something that so many survivors struggle with, that, oh my God, they were picking up on something that I didn't know was there. I must be gay if they saw that in me. Absolutely nothing to do with anything else, nor does being abused by the same-sex perpetrator make you gay. That's something else that people still continue to want to believe, which is absolutely not true whatsoever. But yes, so this is one of the reasons that I think talking about this is so helpful. And I know it's a lot easier now for women to be able to talk about this. Fortunately, more men are coming forward and talking about their own abuse histories. And this really is so important for many reasons. And I think that that is one of them, for sure, so that men can see, so boys can see that there are all kinds of men who have been abused by other men and have never been gay, are not gay, maybe thought that they were gay just because of being abused by a male. But it's not until people start talking about it that we can ever really change these things. And I will say too, that as an advocate and as a therapist, I've been talking about this stuff for nearly 20 years. And it's kind of frustrating sometimes when things will come up in the news and then people are talking about it again. Sometimes people who don't really know what they're talking about, but they'll start talking about it. And it's kind of like it's this new idea. And oh, look, we're talking about this. Those of us who've been doing this work for a long time have been talking about it. It's just that nobody's been listening. So this whole Me Too thing, and even this documentary, which by the way, I did not like the way the documentary itself was done. I liked what James and Wade shared, and how the documentary was done has nothing to do with them. But but in talking about it in general, for survivors to talk about it, for people with platforms to invite survivors and experts to talk about it, that is how we will ultimately change the idea of what it means to experience abuse. It will also help us as a society recognize that an abuser does not look like an abuser, whatever we think that that's supposed to look like. Abusers look like your dad. Abusers look like your neighbor, your coach, your aunt, your biggest celebrity crush, or the celebrity that you look up to and respect the most. Because those people often are abusers. I'm not suggesting that all the people in your life like that are abusers, but the reality is that abusers are those people. They live among us. And when we can start acknowledging that that is possible and stop saying things like, oh, he would never do that. Oh, he loves children. Look at everything he's done for children. He would never do that. He's like a child himself. He would never do that. Or look what she's accomplished in her life. She would never do those things. You're just seeking attention. And that could be somebody who's well known, or that could be a teacher. We have to talk about this so that we can really just accept the truth that abusers do not look a certain way. People who are abused do not look a certain way. I am reading a book right now, a book of fiction, that I'm not that far into it, but I've wanted to just like stop reading it and write something to the person who wrote it, because I'm feeling really pissed off about the way they're describing somebody who was sexually assaulted, who has a history of childhood sexual abuse. But I read other books by this author in the same series, and so I'm thinking it's going to end up going somewhere, and all that's going to be seen as just stereotypes and stuff. But right now it's kind of pissing me off. So, but we need to be able to talk about this, which is why I'm doing this YouTube live, and I'm doing it on YouTube because I tend to have more people watching, and not. A lot of people follow me on YouTube that don't necessarily follow me other places. And this is an important conversation for people to be able to have and to hear. Yes, RM is saying that people kind of refuse to watch the documentary. And partly, I think, I don't know if this is what you're referring to. So some people don't want to watch it because they don't believe it. No, he could never do those things. But the reality is that some people refuse to watch it because they don't want to have to face the reality. They don't want their own feelings to come up, maybe even their own experiences to be triggered. And this kind of brings me to a point that I wanted to bring up as well. This was in the second part of the documentary, when they started having conversations with the mothers once the mothers kind of learned what was going on or whatever. And Wade's mother said, sorry, I'm just looking for my note. Wade's mother had said that she did not want to know anything about the abuse because it would give her nightmares. And I remember when she said that, I just thought, what a luxury. What a luxury to not have to have nightmares about what your son went through. It pissed me off. Not the first time that I've heard something similar. Um, but really think about that. And again, the reason that it bothered me, like, yeah, it pissed me off and I felt bad for Wade. But the reality is she's not the only person who feels that way. Many of you, many survivors out there have heard something similar. And when you hear it in that moment, even if it's not a conscious thought, but when you hear that, what you internalize that as is, oh, I could never tell this person because I wouldn't want to upset them. It reinforces that idea. Oh, I couldn't, it's not okay for me to share the details because I don't want to be the cause for somebody to have nightmares. And so, in your own experience, in that moment, it reinforces that you cannot share what is true, that you have to keep silent, keep that secret to protect somebody else. You've done that far too long. Far too long. You have a right to say and share whatever you want to. If his mother has nightmares, maybe Wade and his mother can talk about the nightmares and support one another through them. Really? As a mom? No, I can't hear that. I don't want to have nightmares. What about what your son is going through? And this isn't just about Wade, this is about anybody out there. What about what your son has had to deal with for, I don't remember how old he was, like 30 years or something? What about the nightmares he has? What about the nightmare that he was living that you are oblivious to? Because, oh, look, isn't this amazing? Well, I asked and he said no. Well, I thought it was weird, but, well, look, he's a celebrity. I've known people like their mothers. I get it. If I was their therapist, I get why they wanted to believe it. I get how they dismissed their own intuition. It doesn't make it okay, but I do get it. But as a person who works with survivors and speaks about this stuff, when I heard her say that, I just wanted to yell at her. What about her son? He doesn't get a choice. He doesn't have an option. And neither do the million of other survivors out there who have heard something similar. If somebody is upset by you speaking your truth, it is not your responsibility. It is the responsibility of the person who chose to give you something to talk about, the person who chose to abuse you. If they hadn't abused you, you wouldn't have anything to say. I know that's a lot easier said than done, and I've done a video on that. But that is the reality. And so, Wade, if you happen to see this, or for anybody else out there whose mother has said something similar, maybe let her know how it feels to you, that you don't get a choice. You have to live with it every single day. Okay, I'll get off that little tangent. Hello, welcome. Helena, I'm not sure what you're saying here. If he loved only himself. I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding that. When Oprah asked James about the ring ceremony, yes. That was something I wrote down too. So Candace is sharing here about when James talked about it in the documentary about a ceremony where he and his abuser said vows to one another. And in the after show, Oprah said, well, once you said those vows, you became complicit. I brought up this briefly in my open letter to her as well. Again, this is another thing that even if consciously you weren't pissed off about it, or consciously you didn't really even think anything specific about it, on a subconscious level, for James to hear it and for anybody else to hear it, even if nobody else has ever said vows to somebody, but in that moment, for James to hear that he was complicit from that point forward, it's going to make me emotional thinking about that, because you're right. He agreed with her, right? He agreed with her in that moment that he became complicit. As a child, there is never a moment that you can be complicit in your own abuse. Never. Doesn't matter what you choose to do. It doesn't matter what behavior you engage in. For a lot of people, you don't even have to be asked necessarily to do something, especially if it's gone on for a while, because you know already what the expectation is. And just like Wade and James shared, it felt better if he was in the bed. It felt better when the abuse happened again. That does not make you complicit in the abuse. James, if you happen to hear this, or if somebody passes this along to James, not for one moment were you complicit in anything at any point, in anything that happened to you. No more after you did those vows than before you did those vows. It changes nothing in that regard. And as a survivor, to hear that, even if you've never said vows or anything with the person who abused you, as a survivor to hear that in that moment, it reinforces that you are somehow a part of the abuse experience. And you are not. It doesn't matter if you have been abused and at 10 or 14 years old, you approach your abuser and strip naked. If that person touches you, they are abusing you. You're not any more to blame for what that person does to you in that moment than you were when you were 4 or 6 or 10. And they had to talk you into sitting on the bed. You are no more responsible then. As an adult, they have sole responsibility for the choice that they make. A reasonable adult, a healthy adult, a person who is not a perpetrator in that moment would say, whoa, what's going on here? Please put your clothes back on. Tell me what's happening, what's going on, and then get them help. Because clearly a child who would do that is struggling in some really significant ways, and they need help. So if you blame yourself because you participated, because you initiated, and I'm saying that kind of like how you would say it to yourself, that's not the reality. That is absolutely not the reality. And I've talked about this in some other videos. When I told about my abuse, I was dismissed and later told I should take a lie detector test. I'm sorry that happened, and Any survivor who watches this can relate. If they've ever tried to tell somebody, they can definitely relate, as can I. I was dismissed and was told I was having a bad dream when I tried to tell at the time that something was happening. And then when I told as an adult, to my mother again, it just, like, the conversation took a turn and nothing was said about it again. And it's devastating because it reinforces, again, it reinforces that we shouldn't tell, that we're not going to be believed, that it doesn't matter. And that is not okay. And it it compounds the impact that it has on you without even having to be aware that it's doing that, but it does. It absolutely compounds it over and over again. And it's never too late to share again. And maybe it's not with the people who won't believe you, but sharing with somebody who will, and just sharing right here can be helpful in knowing that you've been heard and that you are believed. It's incredibly rare for somebody to disclose that they were abused when it didn't actually happen. It's incredibly rare. So Jamie is asking, how long did it take to get so strong, relax, and speak about? Um, Still feel judgment. Just still feeling a lot of judgment. It's taken some time. I feel like I've been on kind of the other side of healing, or if you've seen my video about the journey, I feel like I've been at the summit for at least 10 years at this point, actually, maybe a little bit longer. And I started my journey my very beginning journey in 1990, two, three, 93, I think it was. But I didn't know I was healing. I didn't know I was on a journey. And so my journey wasn't like I went to therapy for a while. I went back, whatever. So it took time. I was in school becoming a social worker and therapist during that time as well. So it took a lot of time. Um, and even earlier on in my career, the idea that I would be doing these videos and sharing on YouTube, like, I wouldn't have never believed that I'd be able to do this. Um, but the reason that I can, like, I felt nervous doing this video today. Before I got on here, I started feeling kind of anxious, and I even said to my husband, doing a YouTube live for some reason feels very different than doing a Facebook live. Um, but my nervousness now is just regular nervousness about being in front of potentially a lot of people. But before, the nervousness was because of shame, because I didn't want people to see the things in me that I believed existed. And so as you heal the shame, it becomes easier to speak about it. Even when somebody gets mad at me, when somebody like thinks that I don't know what I'm talking about or whatever, sure, maybe it doesn't feel very good, but it doesn't necessarily have a significant impact on me at all, because I know that not everybody's going to agree with me, and that's okay. But I know that there's enough people who are listening who feel connected to the things that I share, who are hearing things sometimes in a way for the first time that helps them feel hopeful or can release some of the shame that they've been carrying. So as we release the shame that we hold on to, we feel stronger. We find our voice easier. We don't feel so much that we have to know, like everything has to be perfect in order to speak up. Because anybody who's watched my videos, you know that my videos are not perfect. I don't edit my videos because why? I'm human. I forget what I'm saying sometimes. I use the wrong words sometimes. I spell things wrong sometimes. That's part of being human. And the more that we can show up in our humanity, in our humanness, even when we're struggling, or especially when we're struggling, other people recognize that not only is it okay to be human, but that's the only way that we can be. So it's not about having to be strong enough to share or to talk about it. It's about releasing the shame, and you naturally then come at it from a place of your inherent strength. I hope that makes sense. I actually could go on and on about that. um, oh, no, please don't apologize for your English. Um, okay, so yes, perpetrators will choose children who they think they can get away with it. So in the US, and I know that in other countries it was spoken about a little bit as well, but absolutely. And the grooming process does two things. One, it kind of weeds out children who may not be susceptible to grooming or further grooming. And the grooming process then sets the environment for the perpetrator to be able to abuse and that child not tell. And I do think the documentary, well, not the documentary, but both Wade and James sharing their kind of the totality of their experience was kind of helpful in that it starts in very subtle ways, and there's a lot of like praise and, oh my gosh, we have so much in common, or whatever. So yes, he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that the children looked up to him and he was their idol. He knew that the mothers would be susceptible, or the families would be susceptible to wanting their children to be happy and like their children to be successful, and would also enjoy the benefits that came with having a celebrity as a friend. So, and in that way, parents were also groomed. So yes, perpetrators always choose children and groom children that they think that they're more likely to be able to get away with it. Now, this is important. Them believing that they're more likely to get away with it has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with strength or weakness. It has nothing to do with wearing a banner saying, please abuse me. It has nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with how they groom, how they abuse, and what your family environment is like, what your community is like, and how likely they are to get away with it. So the more you look up to that person, the more your family likes that person, the more you depend on that person, the more you need to believe that that person isn't doing something bad. That's what sets that stage, and why all children are susceptible, because 95% of the time, it is somebody that child has a relationship with or would love to have a relationship with. Like in the US, I don't know how many years ago it's been now, there was a huge thing about I think he was a football coach for a college, Jerry Sandusky. And he created this foundation, this charity for children that didn't have a lot of support in their home or community. Children that having a good male role model and having other children around to interact with would have been a really good thing. Well, did he create the charity for that? I don't know. But the charity and bringing boys in who loved the idea naturally, who felt, even in a sense, kind of helped them feel deserving or worthy, because look at this football coach, really well-known football coach apparently, "Look, he's inviting me in, his organization is inviting me in to participate here." That makes you feel good, that like, that you matter, that automatically sets you up to believe that he cares. So perpetrators know exactly what they're doing. They are pros, and rarely does a perpetrator have one victim. Very rarely. Usually multiple, like at, like you need two hands, if not more, to count. So the people that have come forward about this particular perpetrator in this documentary, um, so we know of what, four or five that had come forward. Um, Without a doubt, there are at least that many that have not come forward, probably a lot more. Um, um, Jamie, I'm not quite sure what you're saying here. I'm sorry. Feeling five senses. I'm I'm sorry. I'm not quite understanding what you're saying there. Yeah, I think that Candace is talking about the grooming process, and a lot of people say, "Well, my kid would tell me." I also think that both Wade and James did a really, not really sure what the best word to use here is, a really kind of explicit example of the grooming process and how he kept them from telling and even having a desire to tell and being willing to lie and all of that. I think that their description of that was really helpful and powerful and very similar. My concern about this documentary and having somebody talk about it where it was done by a celebrity of that magnitude is that I think a lot of people would come away from that thinking, well, okay, but that's, this guy, and look at how big of a star he is. And so it makes sense it could happen there, but it wouldn't happen with the guy down the street, or it wouldn't happen with a high school coach, or it wouldn't happen with an uncle or whatever. And the reality is that yes, that grooming looked different because he was a celebrity, um, and had such access and all of that. But the grooming process exists for everybody. Sometimes it's a very lengthy process, and sometimes it's not. And that has nothing to do with the person being abused. It has to do with a lot of other things related more to the perpetrator and the family that you live in. Um, and as parents, we need to believe that our children would tell us. As a parent myself, I needed to believe that. I really needed to believe that my children would tell me because I knew that just asking wasn't enough. And because it's something that I worried about, if I didn't believe that my children would tell me, I don't know that I would have been able to sleep. I don't know that I would have been able to function. So as parents, we kind of need to believe that to some extent. Now, I think that the parents on this particular documentary, was way beyond them needing to believe it. Like, there were a lot of very specific things that they really should have been able to do differently. Um, but they didn't, and that's a whole other conversation in many senses. Um, oh, thank you, Lupe. I appreciate that. Yeah, they see what they can get away with. Um, and the other thing I know in this particular situation with this documentary, um, I think that they both shared how their abuser said, "You can never tell anybody. We'd both go to jail, or we wouldn't be able to see each other anymore," something like that. And that's a very common thing that abusers will do as a way to manipulate them. Um, and like in this particular for him, he even said we would go to jail. Like they would both go to jail, which is intentional in many ways. But for that child to hear that, it's making it clear that they're somehow responsible for what's happening, because if he would go to jail too, then he must be doing something wrong, which of course he wasn't. So sometimes a perpetrator will say, um, "Oh, if you tell, then this is going to happen." Maybe even threaten violence if you tell, or if you tell, I'll never be able to see you again, or whatever. So sometimes a perpetrator will do that. But there are many, many, many times that a perpetrator doesn't even ever have to say it, because not to tell. None of my perpetrators ever said not to tell, not once. Yet, well, one time I did try to tell, and I was told I was having a bad dream, but yet I never really thought about telling. I just knew not to tell. And I've heard other people talk about that too, that they were never threatened, yet they just knew not to tell. And maybe they even played out in their mind, what if I tell and this happens? That's something that can happen quite often, because there's an inherent understanding. There's a part of you that knows that what this person is doing is not okay, that they shouldn't be doing it. And that doesn't make you complicit, it doesn't make it your fault. There's a part of you that knows that something good can't feel that bad, even if it doesn't hurt. But there's something in you that just doesn't feel right. And inherently, that that telling isn't going to turn out to be the best thing that you could do. And hopefully that changes over time. The more people are talking about it, the more children are aware, the more parents and society recognizes the symptoms, and even symptoms of a grooming process. I think over time that will hopefully change, but you don't have to be threatened in order not to tell. And I think that's something that a lot of survivors hold on to shame around, is that I should have told. Why didn't I tell? So I'm saying that for survivors to know, and I'm also saying that again as a myth. You do not have to be told not to tell. You do not have to be threatened in order not to tell. We just don't tell. Um, Forgiveness. Yeah, just knew not to say anything. I agree. He never should have had that kind of access. Um, a celebrity or not, he never should have had that access. And I suspect, obviously, this isn't going to be the case across the board, but I do suspect that had he not been a celebrity, especially not to the caliber that he was, he wouldn't have had that access. He wouldn't have. I really don't believe that he would have. But we, as just as a society, celebrities do things all the time that regular people would never be able to do. We put people who have money and a lot of fans, um, who are well known, who have music on the radio, we put those people in those positions. They don't put themselves there. We put them there by idolizing them, by somehow thinking that they're better than the rest. And I really do feel like, in many ways, this was a cautionary tale about we need to stop doing that. We need to stop thinking that just because somebody is a celebrity, that they're somehow good or better, that they're more trustworthy, that because they have a lot of money, that somehow means something about their character. It absolutely doesn't. But I do agree that I don't think that most parents, had he been just a member of the community, even a fairly well-known member of their small community, like, nobody would have thought that that was okay. Not for a moment. And he absolutely used his celebrity. He knew exactly what he was doing. Him going out there after, one of the court hearings, it might have been after he was, acquitted, I don't remember, I think it was the first time, but he went out and spoke to his fans. Um, had he been just an average person, well, the reality is he probably still wouldn't have been convicted, but to have all of those people out there with signs and all of that, it really affects us individually, again, on a subconscious level, in how we perceive what is right and what is true. And unfortunately, I think in some ways, social media and Instagram in particular, and even YouTube, to be quite honest, has um, has just given a lot of people a lot of power that can end up being harmful in a lot of ways. Um, so it's important for us as individuals, not just survivors, but as individuals, to be mindful of that. So um, the forgiveness piece, I did write that down as well. Um, James also said in the after show that he found that he was feeling guilty talking about it then on the after show, that just talking about it then, he was feeling guilty. That in some way, and he didn't say this specifically, I don't think, like he felt like he was betraying him. That's something I know many of us can relate to. Um, it's certainly not about celebrity in that regard. And that I thought was really powerful because it is something that so many of us can relate to. There were just so many things in particular that James said that I wanted to speak to him. Like I wanted to be able to say to him um, a lot of things, and that was one of the things that he said that I just like. I did say it. I think I might have even said it out loud. Obviously, he didn't hear me, but so many things that I just wanted to be able to say to both of them. Honestly, that I wish somebody would have been able to say to him. Um, so the piece about seduction, and this is the letter that I wrote to Oprah, and I shared in the description of this video. I shared a link to that open letter that I wrote to Oprah, so you can get a better understanding of what I'm referring to here. Um, and I know that I do believe that she means well, without any doubt. And but again, the subconscious idea of calling what they experienced or what we as survivors experience as a seduction suggests on that subconscious level that we think of seduction as we would with an adult, between two adults, right? So we automatically translate that to a similar dynamic between the child and the perpetrator. And so, in using the word seduction or saying between us, it's kind of similar. Um, it implies that even through the grooming process, that you kind of agreed, that you felt that it was okay in some way. And I wrote a post about this on social media and said that the definition implies or suggests, actually is defined as consent, something else. And then I also looked up acquiescence, which is different than consent, but still kind of a similar thing. So no matter how you look at it with seduction, whether it's consent, ultimately consenting, or acquiescence, both of those things still suggest that you're making a choice. And as a child in that situation, you are not making a conscious choice to engage in whatever ends up happening. But when a survivor hears seduction, when a regular person hears seduction, even if on one hand they can say, oh, it's not their fault, when you hear seduction, it reinforces that it's sex, that it's something that happens between those people. And if you're just now coming on, go back, please, and watch that piece. It is never something that happens between people. I remember when I had disclosed that my brother was one of my abusers, and my sister didn't really want to know about it. But she said, I don't know what happened between you. And by that time, I had done a lot of healing. And when she said that, because again, that's just kind of a thing that people automatically say, it seems like it's something that happens between two people. But no, never does it happen between two people. What she should have said, what people in general should say, when he abused you. But when she said, I don't know what happened between you, I let her know that nothing happened between us, that he abused me. But we have to be mindful, even as survivors, and anybody who's worked with me knows that I will say something to them in sessions often when they refer to an experience in a way that's reinforcing a level of responsibility. We as survivors need to be mindful of that, because when we say that, we're reinforcing the idea that somehow we're complicit, that somehow we are a part of that, and we are not. So the letter that I wrote to Oprah, I go into that a little bit more around the idea of seduction. The idea of forgiveness. So yes, in the after show, Oprah asked, I believe both of them, if they had forgiven their mothers. And I believe that neither of them feel like they've forgiven their mothers. And I don't remember exactly what they said about it, but I don't think that either one of them have forgiven. I think they're kind of working on maybe forgiving or something like that. And not necessarily just specifically in asking the question, have you forgiven your mothers, doesn't necessarily imply that they have to. But I know that this is something that survivors struggle with all the time. And society will often say you need to forgive. You do not need to forgive anybody for any role that they played in what happened to you, for not believing you or not knowing or whatever. You do not have to forgive that person in order to heal. And I've done a video on this as well. So whether Wade or James are listening to this, or anybody else, you do not need to forgive the people who should have known or did know and didn't do anything. You do not need to forgive them in order to heal. I think it's important to talk about that and heal that, but you don't have to forgive that. And I think that I don't know about Wade, but I think James in particular felt like he was kind of struggling with that idea that maybe he needs to forgive and he's gotta kind of find a way to get there, and so no, absolutely not. She also said, um, she asked if they've forgiven themselves, and I thought that this was really a good question. When she asked that, I wrote it down, and so I don't actually remember what their responses were. James, I think, said no. I think that Wade actually might have said that he did forgive himself. But I wrote this down because, again, this implies that they have something, that they've done something that they need to forgive, which is not true. I used to speak about this um, in regards to forgiveness. I used to say the only forgiveness necessary to heal is forgiving yourself for the things that you think that you did wrong or should have done better or whatever. And I still believe that in one way of looking at it. I absolutely believe that you don't need to forgive your perpetrator. But I've kind of adjusted or shifted the way that I talk about forgiving yourself. Because when you think about forgiving yourself or self forgiveness, it does imply that there's something to forgive yourself for, like not saying no or something like that. And I used to talk about it that way. But what I've really kind of realized over time and talking about this over and over again is it's not even so much about forgiving yourself for something like that, because again, there's nothing to forgive. There's absolutely nothing there to forgive. So instead of calling it or referring to it as forgiving yourself for something, I try to speak about it now as kind of letting yourself off the hook or accepting that, like understanding why you might have done those things or why you didn't do the things that you think you should have done, why you coped in the way that you did, why you didn't say no, why you, in your own mind, went along with, or whatever it is that you're saying to yourself. People often have a lot of shame around the ways that they've coped. Um, and so I used to talk about forgiving yourself for the ways that you coped that weren't healthy or whatever. But now I talk about it as having compassion for the ways that you coped, having compassion for a child that didn't know better or so desperately wanted attention or love that you believed that that's what it was, that the thought of telling maybe didn't cross your mind. So instead of thinking about it as self forgiveness now, I talk about it as self compassion. And I did want to touch on it for that reason, because I don't want anybody to think that there's actually things, that there are actually things that you need to forgive yourself for because of the implication of what that might mean. That you've done something wrong in some way, that you should have done it differently. So let me go back here. Well, this is an interesting question. There's a username, so I'm not quite sure what your name is. Sonomar, I think. Would you say a teen who is over the legal age of consent, say 16 or 7, be partially complicit if he or she had been groomed by a family member over several years prior? No, I wouldn't say that. And really, like, and this is kind of tricky, like the legal age, that's always, like, that's a legal thing. That's purely a legal thing because developmentally, the impact that it has on you doesn't matter what age you actually are, like chronologically what age you are. So, especially if there was some grooming going on there, then no, absolutely not. Would I call it complicit in that scenario? Josephina, yes. Yes, I hear it all the time. And also in like even without it being in part of the spiritual community, but especially in the spiritual community, the idea of you have to forgive. Um, and forgiveness is about you, it's not about the other person. But and maybe that's true, but it doesn't mean that you need to forgive. It still does not mean that you need to forgive. And I did do a video on forgiveness. It's part of my Q&A series, and it's a relatively recent video that I did, something along the lines of, "Is forgiveness necessary for healing?" or something along that line. And I kind of talk about this a lot more in depth. So if you haven't seen that, it might be helpful to take a look. But yes, that idea of forgiveness, and it drives me crazy. And I know that for many people, it comes from a very well-meaning place, and they really believe that that's the key. Um, and it especially really frustrates me when I hear a therapist or a coach or something telling somebody who's been abused or hurt by somebody in an intentional way that you have to forgive. That is incredibly dismissive and damaging to the person. Even if you believe that healing or that forgiveness is helpful in healing, you can share that. You can share why you think that forgiveness can be helpful, and this is what's been helpful for me, or whatever. But to tell somebody that they have to forgive is wrong in many ways. um, yes. Uh, Wade talked, I think it was Wade. Actually, I think they both kind of talked about children, but that if it hadn't been for becoming a father himself, he wouldn't have realized that what happened to him was wrong. Um, yes, one of the things that I've recognized that happens a lot for people is they might be doing really well. Maybe they've done a lot of healing, or maybe they haven't done any healing. They're just in a lot of denial. um, but having a child, or having a child that gets to the age that you were when you were abused, is often a really, really big trigger, especially for people that haven't done any healing. Um, it's a huge trigger for kind of obvious reasons, I suppose, but it is a really big trigger for a lot of people, and that's when a lot of people will end up going to try to work on their own healing. And sometimes they're still not equating that the reason that they're having all these thoughts, or they're feeling so angry, or they're so like worried or hyper vigilant or whatever, like they may not equate it, like they may not connect the dots there. Um, which obviously there are some very serious dots that could be connected. Um, Thank you. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce your name. I don't know if it's Saki. Thank you so much for commenting and watching. Sharing that someone said you can either forgive or get revenge. Wow, those are two really powerful things to suggest to somebody, and neither which I believe are true um, at all. That in forgiving, that you kind of have power, then that you're not giving them power anymore. I don't really believe that that's true either. So if you haven't seen that video, it might be helpful to take a look at that. Um, Forgiveness is such a kind of loaded um, word and idea, I think, across across cultures, across faiths, and people's ideas of forgiveness can be very different. But really, I believe no matter what your idea of forgiveness is, to believe that you have to forgive in order to be a good person, in order to be a good Christian, in order to go to heaven, not go to hell, in order to heal. I don't believe that any of those things are true. And I don't believe it because of the work that I've done with survivors over the nearly 20 years. And quite frankly, because of my own experience, I haven't forgiven my abusers. None of them have asked. None of them have asked. I don't have relationships with any of them any longer. Um, but I've never forgiven. I don't feel the need to forgive because when you heal, you get to a place where that's not necessarily on your radar at all. Because the difficulty that we struggle with isn't really about forgiveness. If we struggle with forgiveness, it's because we have an idea that we should forgive. Um, and that there's something wrong with us if we can't, or we're a bad person if we can't, or whatever. So if you haven't seen that video, I can come back in and share a link in the description for that video as well. So I will try to remember to do that. So uh, one of the things too that was said, and it's kind of maybe briefly been talked about already, but they both talked about how they didn't they didn't recognize that what happened was really abuse initially. That even as an adult, they wouldn't necessarily describe it as abuse, and that's a really common thing. Um, and Wade even talked about going to therapy, but not talking about it because he didn't realize that that played a role. And I've had this happen with clients all the time. Um, and so, what I would say is even if you don't think it's relevant, if you're going to therapy because having some sort of issue, if you're going to therapy, your therapist knowing that you've had this history is going to be really important for them to be able to help you, especially if you've not done any healing around it. Because nobody can go through that experience and not be affected by it. And and even if the current struggle that you're going to therapy for seems totally unrelated to any abuse, one of the most damaging aspects of being abused is that it permeates all areas of your life because it directly impacts your belief in yourself, your worthiness. It creates a depth of shame that is so profound that it shows up in so many ways in our lives. So, even for you, even if you're not going to therapy, but you recognize that you just keep struggling and you haven't talked about the abuse, you haven't dealt with it, you haven't healed it, I can almost guarantee that it's playing a role in your struggle, no matter what that struggle is. Relationship issues, not trying to further your career, going from one job to the next, um, self esteem, self doubt, just having the same fight over and over again, struggling with a lot of anger or sadness or depression or anxiety. All of those things are related to abuse. And you can heal. You can heal. It's not an easy process. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of practice, and it takes a lot of patience. And it takes somebody who really knows what they're doing. Not somebody who listened to 3 videos and now is trauma informed. Not somebody who took a $15 course on Udemy and now is an expert. Not somebody who has a certification in something but doesn't have actual clinical training and experience. Because when you go to somebody who doesn't have that, all of those things that we've talked about for this whole hour and a half are reinforced because they don't understand it either. That's another tangent that I can go off on, so I'm gonna try to bring it back. Um, James said, uh, "Time does not heal all wounds." I was so glad he said that. It is absolutely true. Absolutely true. And when it comes to experiencing difficulty in childhood, really any significant difficulty in childhood, time by itself, if you're not doing anything to heal it, makes those wounds deeper and deeper and more hidden, which makes it harder for them to heal when you do recognize them. Time absolutely does not heal all wounds. And that kind of goes to the idea, if you've seen my other videos, if you know me, one of the things that I say all the time is you cannot heal what you deny is wounded. And even just thinking about James and Wade and them sharing their story, the denial there is that it was abuse and that they were affected by it. So there's two significant aspects of denial there. So going to therapy and not thinking that abuse affected you is a form of denial. So then you talk about everything else but that. Well, of course, you're not really going to get the help that you need because you're not talking about the real problem. So denial doesn't mean that you don't remember. That can be an aspect of denial, but that's not the denial that most people experience, and that's not the denial I'm referring to. But if we don't recognize, if we're not able to say, this was abuse, if we're not able to say, I'm struggling, and these are all the things that left me not feeling so good at some point, then we're not going to be able to heal the actual wound. We're just going to keep putting band-aids on all these other things. We're going to take meds to try to feel better. But none of that heals the underlying wound. Um, so I was glad that he said that. You did not go along with it. It was not a choice that you made. Uh, yeah. If you have an abuse history and you have not done the depth of work required to heal that, there's no doubt that whatever you're struggling with in your current life, there's a connection. There is a connection. I can really feel like I can guarantee that. There may be some things that may not be an absolute with that, but without a doubt, because it affects everything that you believe about yourself. And of course, what you believe about yourself dictates everything about what you think, feel, do, how you show up in the world, what you believe about the world, what you believe about other people, how you trust people or don't. It affects everything, absolutely everything. Well, welcome. Just joining. Thank you for joining me in this conversation. I really appreciate everybody who has been here. I know some of you have been here maybe the whole time. I don't know. Some of you just for a while, but either way, thank you for taking this time to participate in this conversation, for sharing your thoughts and experiences and feelings and reactions. The more that we can talk about this, the less shame we feel ultimately. Because the more people understand, the more survivors understand all of this, the less shame inherently there will be for all of this. And I'm not saying that you have to share in a public way. Even just having a conversation with a friend, acknowledging that we're struggling, that goes such a long way in reducing the stigma and the shame of struggle because there is nothing to be ashamed of. We all struggle. 1 in 3 to 4 girls, 1 in 5 to 6 boys is sexually abused by the time they reach the age of 18. So that's not including stuff that happens as an adult. And if you think about how many people you know in your life, that's a lot of people who are not acknowledging the truth. And when we don't acknowledge the truth, we are denying the reality to that little child that lives inside of us. We are telling her or him that her truth doesn't matter, that his truth isn't important. And ultimately, what that says is you're not important. We have to be able to start talking about this stuff. And I'm not saying it's your responsibility to talk about it in a big way, but don't allow yourself to be silenced because of those around you. Don't allow yourself to be silenced because you're afraid that it's going to hurt somebody else. Because anybody that is hurt by your truth is hurt by the perpetrator who hurt you. Try to remember that. I know, again, much easier said than done. It is my pleasure to have this conversation and to hold a space for all of us, really, because every time that I do a video, whether it's a live or recorded video, every time I interact with all of you, I am sharing my truth as well. I'm sharing not only my truth as a survivor, but I'm sharing my truth as somebody who does this work, somebody who has struggled with sharing with people who may not want to hear the truth. So this is really good practice for me as well to be able to do this. Um, yes, Dana. I didn't, I think I did get to a point, maybe even as a teenager, when I recognized that it was abuse. And it would have been only because I heard it somewhere. Or I might have even thought of it as molesting, which I don't like that word, and I think it's very minimizing. Um, but so I might have been molest that I kind of thought about, but I didn't really even know what that meant. I didn't know it was significant or anything else. Um, but I didn't know that I was affected by it. I thought I was just bad and crazy. I thought I was a slut. I thought I was just bad. I thought I was damaged. I thought there was something just inherently wrong with me. Um, I thought all kinds of things that were a result of what I experienced as a child, but didn't know that there was an impact. Uh, you bring up a good point here about age, and I've done a video on this as well. um, so I'm sorry, I do not know how to pronounce your name. I would totally mess it up. But you're sharing about age range and like 10 and 11 years old. So I have done a video on this. It's easy for us to dismiss that as well. But ultimately, what matters is how did it leave you feeling? And whether it's legally abuse, whether anybody else sees it as abuse, if it left you feeling badly in some way, then it's important to do healing around that. Dana, thank you for saying this. This is a really important point, too. I'm really glad that you brought this up. So Dana is saying, kind of being confused by Oprah, and that she's a survivor. And I mean, she's Oprah. So, most of us will listen to something that Oprah says and buy into it, right? We believe it, um, for a lot of reasons. And much of what she says, I absolutely agree with. She's talked with a lot of experts over the years. She's had lots of conversations with people over the years. She has she's learned a lot, no doubt. And of course, she's also a survivor. And this is part of the reason that I wrote the open letter to her, because um, when you combine those two things, we see her as kind of an authority, right? In lots of ways, we see her as an authority. And because she has an abuse history and talks about it and talks about the things that she's learned over the years, then we believe her as an authority even more. Just like a lot of you, because I do these videos and I talk about being a survivor, you automatically see me as an authority. You believe that more and more the more videos you watch, right? Because you connect with the things that I say. I suppose also the fact that I've been a therapist for a long time probably helps there too. Um, but to hear Oprah say anything really, right? Um, we automatically, again, without having to consciously think about it, we automatically believe her. And so even when she says something contrary to what we might feel or think or believe, we doubt. We think, oh, wait a second. And then, especially if somebody else agrees, like when James agreed with, yes, I was complicit, like then it's like, okay, wait a second. Maybe I'm wrong here. And this is why I wrote the open letter, because there's inherent power and authority that people with big platforms, and I don't consider this channel a big platform, relatively speaking, but I still take it seriously. Um, but automatically, there's an inherent level of authority that is there. And so, all of us, survivor or not, we buy into it a little bit more. So, that's a very good point that you brought up, um, Dana. So, thank you. Yeah, Nancy, really talking about it in general and identifying the things that we feel ashamed of is incredibly helpful. And talking about it with people outside of a therapist, I think is really important as well. And always group. Group is such an important piece of being able to heal for a lot of reasons. Oh, it really is such an honor for me to be here and share this space with all of you. And for those of you that have been on this video call for the time that we've been on here, it's been almost 2 hours. Um, Thank you for sharing this time with me and sharing the space for me and sharing yourself in the comments as well. And if you're watching this on replay, please feel free to also share your comments, your thoughts, your reflections. If there's things that you disagree with, I want to hear about that as well. Um, I want to hear other perspectives. I had an interesting kind of Facebook conversation with somebody that I don't know well, but somehow we're connected on Facebook. And she's not a survivor, but she talked about how the word seduction didn't make her feel like they were consenting or anything. So we had this conversation, and a few pieces in, um, she used the word that they tolerated it because he was a superstar and they loved him. And, on one hand, she's saying, no, the idea of being seduced didn't make me think that they were to blame. But ultimately, she did believe that they tolerated it and chose to tolerate it because he was a superstar. So even though on a conscious level she's saying, well, no, it wasn't their fault, on another level, there's a part of her that believes that they were a part of it, that they made a choice to be a part of it. And again, that's why language and understanding our own language and how we talk to ourselves is so important. Yes. Repressed memories are or forgotten memories. Sometimes they're truly repressed, like in our unconscious mind, like completely repressed in that way. But sometimes we can also say repressed where they're just not um, like readily available. Uh, and those are different things, and it doesn't matter which one it is, but very often they do come up when something triggers it. And again, just being in a safe space sometimes can create the environment for things to start coming back. And while that may feel like a bad thing, it truly isn't a bad thing at all. So, so again, thank you everybody for joining me. I really appreciate your time and your willingness to share the things that you've shared in the comments. If you are relatively new to me, I do have a lot of videos over the last, actually, I think I started this channel in 2013. Um, so you might find a lot of things. There's some things that I talked about here that I've made videos specifically on. You can also find me at courageousjourneys.com and on Facebook. You can find me at Peggy Oliveira, actually. I have a public profile there. Um, so if we're not connected, please connect with me. I do have a place on my website where you can sign up and download a little kind of using affirmations in a way that can help heal uh, handbook that you can download for free if you're not already on my list. Uh, so you can hop over there and gain access to that. Lindsay, this is a great question. Like, so do you need to have the coping skills before you can start talking about it, or do you just jump into talking about it? So what I would say is, again, ideally you're talking about it with a therapist. Um, or if you're just sharing with a friend or something, I would say it's important to have one of the most important things is have somebody that can support you. So somebody who knows that it happened and who believes you and is supportive. So that by itself can go a really long way. If your coping skills are really unhealthy, like potentially harming yourself in some significant way, or an addictive behavior that you've not engaged in for some time, then yes, I think that's important. But this is kind of a paradox in a sense because little chicken and egg, because building healthy coping skills, even if you have a conscious awareness of what you can do instead that's healthy, it's hard to do that if you're not in some way kind of talking about some of this stuff. So if you're going to therapy, I think that's a great question to talk with your therapist about because they're going to know a little bit more about you. They'll see how maybe anxious you feel in the session. They can ask you some specific questions. If you tend to be very I'm gonna say easily triggered, but that's not like a weakness or anything like that. I don't mean it in a negative way. But if you find that you're triggered quite often or in a very significant way, then I think it's important to build a sense of safety first. And this is where grounding techniques come in and play a really important role. So it's not even so much about having to build healthy coping skills. I would say that having some really helpful grounding, which is a coping skill, I guess. So yes, Having some solid ways of grounding yourself before you talk about it can be really important. And there's lots of things that you can do to ground. Um, I haven't done a video specifically about this, but I do have the video in the Journey to Wholeness course that I have. A whole week is dedicated to grounding. Um, and I also have a meditation for creating a safe space or creating refuge, which is creating a safe space, a visualization and meditation that you can go through. And I have that on a meditation album. So I can share that link in the description of the video as well. So I would say grounding, which is a form of coping, grounding experiences, grounding tools are an important piece to have there. And support can be a part of that as well. Penny, hi. This is a new name. I always love seeing new names. Join me. Yeah. Learning new ways of coping is an important piece. And a lot of times a therapist will kind of work you through a process of feeling grounded, kind of creating some stability in your nervous system. Sometimes a therapist will work a lot on doing that um, first, and that can be helpful. So I think it's important to kind of talk to your therapist about that. But I've also known a lot of people who, when they decide to go to therapy, like they're just ready, like they just want to share. And so I think that that can be okay too. Because what I found will happen sometimes is, okay, you do the work week after week to build healthy coping mechanisms to feel safe and all of that, which I'm not saying that's not important, but people will often end up dropping out because typically when you decide to go, you've got like all this energy and okay, I'm going to do this. And then when you have to spend time doing things that feel like maybe they're not necessarily helping a whole lot or it's not what you wanted to go to therapy for, it just can feel a little kind of deflating in a sense. And so people will drop off. So I think talking to a therapist about it can be helpful. And you can, I think, work on incorporating some grounding and healthy coping while you're also sharing some things as well. What if people buy into your minimizing? This is a great, important point because people will almost always, well, maybe I shouldn't, it depends on who those people are. A lot of people will very happily buy into your minimizing and help you minimize because they don't want to accept the full reality of it either. So even therapists will buy into your minimizing because they don't know what to do with it. So yes, that does happen a lot. Um, so what I would say about that is you need a new therapist for sure. And it doesn't mean that therapist is necessarily a bad therapist generally, but not a great therapist for survivors. But you also say here, headlessly paraphrased me like, yes, you mentioned that it had a touch of sexual abuse when your mother did that. So, in that sense, could she have been, and I don't know, obviously, I don't know here. So, was she kind of agreeing with you in that sense? That that's what happened, that that's what it was? Or was she saying that that's how you phrased it? Because those might be different things. But if she was suggesting that that's what it was, then I think it might be an important thing to see a different therapist. It was actually one of my therapists who pointed out to me that I was completely detached and minimized my own experience. She said, You just shared that, you just went through all of that, you shared all of that, but you sounded like a news reporter reporting on a news story, and that was the first time I'd ever heard it said like that, um, and I thought, "Well, yeah, no, it's fine, I can talk about it, it doesn't bother me." And, of course, fortunately, she had heard that before, so she was able to say, "Well, just because it doesn't feel like it's bothering you, it doesn't mean that it's not." Um, and so I had a lot to learn after that, even beyond the sessions that I had with her. So, but the people around you, friends, family members, again, even therapists sometimes will be very happy to support you in the minimization of your experience. And that is part of the reason why we need to be able to share with people who really do understand it. Because I think in some aspects, you could look at this documentary or the after show, and there were different things that were said that not by Wade or, well, Wade and James certainly minimized their own experience, but there were some other things that were certainly minimizing their experience as well. Um, so, yeah. And that's one of the things that happens all the time when we tell people that it's happened. Um, and sometimes the way that they minimize it might even be coming from a place of, like one of the things that will happen often is people will say, "Well, at least this didn't happen." Like at least when I finally told my mother as an adult about my stepfather, she said, "Well, um, well, he didn't rape you, did he? Because he didn't force sexual intercourse on me." Um, and so things like that are minimizing. And she didn't say it wasn't coming from a good place from her. It was coming from her own inability to deal with it. But even like I've heard people say, well, at least he didn't penetrate you, or at least it wasn't your father. I've heard that said several times, and not to me specifically, but just that's been said to people. And not only is that dismissive, but it's incredibly minimizing. But to them, it seems like, oh, well, it could be worse. So be grateful for this. No, do not. To tell somebody to find the gratitude or the blessing in everything, that's another thing that really irritates the heck out of me. Um, you do not need to find the blessing or the gratitude or the strength or anything else in abuse in order to heal from it or to be a good person. I will say that Leaving Neverland was very graphic. They in pretty graphic detail described things that happened to them, which obviously can be very triggering. But really, even the other pieces where they were describing their abuse experiences, but even the mother's reactions and stuff like that, like there's a lot of different pieces that could be triggering. But especially in part one, there was a lot of very graphic detail that could be triggering for a lot of people. Um, so I think it's important to be mindful of that. It aired on HBO, and HBO, I think in conjunction maybe with No More or Rain.org, created I don't even really know what to call it necessarily. It was on a website, but kind of some things to consider, kind of some things to help ground you to not be too triggered as you watched it. So you might be able to find that, like Leaving Neverland checklist or something. Um, I think there was value in much of the documentary itself, but quite honestly, I don't think that there was necessarily more value in that than hearing other people talk about their own stories, necessarily. So, but I do think that having the mothers talk about it and their struggle with it, I think that that had certainly had some value for both survivors and other people that aren't survivors. Yes, so Marian's talking about finding a good therapist in different areas can be quite the challenge, and it can. And I will say that that's one of the most difficult things for me when people are searching for somebody is knowing that finding somebody who really is going to be good for them isn't an easy thing to do. Um, and that is a challenge. And so, a couple of things that I would say if you have a rape crisis center area or a rape crisis center in your area, and they're not just in the US, they are international. Not every community has one, but if you have a rape crisis center, they often provide low cost or free counseling and sometimes groups. So start there. And they often can provide referrals as well. Um, and so in that case, it can sometimes be helpful to work with somebody who doesn't necessarily maybe have a lot of experience on that, but maybe you are like maybe following somebody that does have a lot of experience. Maybe you're reading books by actual like therapists that have a lot of experience that can kind of give you other avenues of understanding and insight. Um, I know that working with me is not an option for a lot of people. I do provide one-on-one mentoring with people all over the world via Skype or Zoom. Uh, so if that seems like something that you might be interested in, courageousjourneys.com, click on your journey and you can find out about that. I do actually have an opening right now. Um, so I do provide that one-on-one service as a mentor. And if you're interested, you can reach out to me and I can explain the difference between those two things. Additionally, if you are on Facebook, I have a closed Facebook group called Courageous Warriors that you can sign up for. You sign up through my website, and then you have to request to join on Facebook. A lot of people are requesting to join on Facebook, but not signing up on my website. So you have to do both in order to be admitted into the group. It's a great group of survivors that just have created a really beautiful space. And then I hop in there and share things and connect with people as well. I'll show that link in the comments, but that is courageousjourneys.com/courageous warriors. So that can be helpful. And then this would not be the sole thing that I would want you to do, either the Facebook group or I have an online course and group that I'm going to be opening up again very soon for survivors called Journey to Wholeness that incorporates a lot of the different aspects of healing. It won't be everything that you need to fully heal, but it's a really good kind of foundational and diving deeper into aspects of healing. And I will be opening that soon. And part of what that will be is group stuff together that we come together. With some Q&A and a Facebook group that we share together. So there, if you don't have somebody that you're working with, or even if you do, a group can still be a great addition to that. And there may be some other people online that you might be able to find that can help. So if you are possibly interested in working with me again, courageousjourneys.com. And then go to your journey, and it's the Journey to Freedom one-on-one mentorship. It's a 6-month mentorship, so you can find out more there. How do you know when you're no longer needing therapy? You won't be struggling as much. You will have things that come up and you will feel differently about them. You won't hold on to shame any longer. You won't find yourself doubting yourself as often. You will feel worthy of all the things in your life that you deserve. There isn't a specific thing that you can point to say, okay, now I'm healed. And it's not something that just happens and you know. It's you recognize as time goes on how different things are. Um, you realize that you're not struggling in the same ways. You realize that you're not ashamed of talking about the abuse. And I don't mean that you can talk about it, because a lot of people can talk about it from that place of like reporting on it. Um, but ultimately, it's really about releasing the shame. And one of the ways that you know that you've been able to release the shame is if you thought about sharing, not specifically the abuse, but are there things about yourself or about your experiences in life, the way that you think, the way that you feel, the things that you've done, experienced, if you thought about somebody knowing about that, does it feel like, oh my God, what would happen if they knew it? Does it feel like, oh my God, I could never tell that person that? If so, there's still some shame attached to that. And it doesn't mean you need to get to a place where you do tell that person that. It just means that you need to get to a place where you don't have that kind of reaction when you think about telling somebody that. So that's a pretty big indicator there. But again, it doesn't mean that you have to be okay with sharing it with everybody. It just means that if you think about it, it doesn't create a lot of, you know what feeling I'm talking about, like that, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, I can't do that. It just creates all that intensity of feeling. Okay, so this time I really am going to end this conversation, but I cannot believe that there are 22 people on this video right now. Thank you so much, truly, for everybody who has participated in this conversation. Um, I really do appreciate you being here. I appreciate you sharing your voice. I kind of wish there would have been a way for us to do this where I could have had people actually on video having this conversation with me, because I always think that that's a really great way to have this conversation, or these kinds of conversations. So thank you so much for watching. If there's somebody in your life, somebody that you know that might benefit from pieces of this conversation, even if they're not a survivor, or somebody that you want specifically to know certain things so that they understand you better. But if there's anybody in your life that you think might benefit from understanding abuse more, understanding survivors more, please consider sharing this. Maybe there's some specific pieces that you thought were particularly important, and maybe you have an idea of like where at in this 2 hours and 17 minutes that showed up. Maybe you can share with them, around 25 minutes, around 15 minutes, or around an hour and a half, or whatever. Like, just watch that. But the idea is that maybe this platform grows so that I can reach even more people, or that other people start talking about things differently, so that ultimately we change the way that people talk about this stuff. Because when people change the way when people change the way they talk about it, it changes the way that we all feel about it. It changes what we believe about it. And if we can do that, it lessens the overall impact that survivors end up experiencing. So thank you again for joining me. I hope that you have a beautiful rest of your weekend, and remember self-compassion. Self-compassion. It's not about forgiveness. It's not about a right and wrong way to do something. It's about self-compassion. So thank you so much. Have a beautiful rest of your weekend.